just to be like,
Yeah.
hey, plug it and pump it. I don't know why I did that. I'm sorry.
That's going to be the cold open for this, just so you know. The rest is just noise. Hello, and welcome to The Rest is Just Noise. I'm your host, Andrew Mitchell. We've got something a little bit different for you today. The conversation we're about to have was actually recorded about a month ago and was supposed to form a follow-up to our main episode coming out in April. But it felt particularly prescient for some news which has come out in the UK this past week, so we wanted to get it out there for you. For some background, a new law has been proposed by the UK Conservative government, giving police tougher powers to crack down on protesters. There are a lot of aspects to this bill, many of which are concerning, but importantly for this podcast, it includes new vague language to impose noise limits on protests. The government has said that this is needed to counter, quote, highly disruptive tactics used by some protesters that cause a disproportionate impact on the surrounding communities. Now, I and other noise professionals have some concerns about how these limits could work in practice and whether there's any sort of justification for saying that these protests cause a disproportionate impact. But I think the more important discussion to have is around what making noise means to a protest itself and what some of the consequences of a law like this might be. Well, last month I spoke with sociologist and soundscape researcher Edda Bild about a concept called sonic appropriation. And we discussed what it means for marginalized communities and protesters to be able to gain control over their sonic environment. We also discussed some of our own personal experiences, including mine, protesting here in London and what sound in those environments really means for the cohesiveness of a protest. As I said, the main episode, which this was meant to follow, is an interview with Edda and her colleague, Daniel Steele, about their Musikiosk project, which was really fascinating. So make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts to keep an ear out for our longer conversation there. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this surprisingly timely conversation that I had with Edda about sonic appropriation. Edda, thanks so much for joining me again. What I wanted to do is there is something that you said in our main episode, our main conversation, that I hadn't really heard about before, and I kind of wanted to just dive back into it a bit more and explore it more. So you mentioned this concept of acoustic appropriation. So
Right.
Could you just tell me sort of how you conceive of it and how you apply it to the Musikiosk stuff that we were talking about before?
Right. So, like I warned you, the concept is, from the sounds of it, I went back a little bit to the literature and checked it. I think in sort of like sociology or ethnography, it's actually sonic appropriation. However, the idea behind it stays the same. It's about the fact that when you're of people who appropriate to take over their spaces, not just physically, but also acoustically or sonically, if you wish. So this is something that comes a lot from a literature on, revolutions, on people who have been, communities who have been minoritized, who have been vulnerable, who reappropriate their spaces, again, not just physically, but also sonically by manifesting their presence in the space. So that's something that you will see a lot of various protests in the street. For example, there were some protests in, I want to say Argentina anyway, somewhere in South America, where they were using pots and pans. They were really banging pots and pans together. And that has become a canonic form of protest. And that is a way of acoustically appropriating, because there you're really making your presence known. You're really saying, you don't want us in the space. You don't want us here, but here we are loud and clear. And you have to listen to what we're saying. So that was something that is very interesting for me, just personally, from how different people who are usually not necessarily welcome in public spaces or, in spaces that are meant to be shared, how they occupy their spaces also acoustically. That's something that's very interesting for me, also from a perspective of like feminist studies and protests that had taken place especially in Latin America, but throughout Europe and everywhere in the world, for women taking over the public spaces that traditionally are not necessarily spaces where they feel safe or where they feel welcome.
When I went to the BLM protests in London,
Mm-hmm.
something I found really fascinating was the difference that came over the crowd as soon as any chants started.
Mm.
Right? Like it was sort of it felt a bit unfocused at the start, but then as soon as like a chant could make its way through the crowd, the whole crowd just sort of created this, more of the group solidarity sort of thing when the sound was able to spread through it, which is something I hadn't really experienced before outside of, I suppose, music, because music you get a similar sort of thing, but that was
when you go to a concert, you would get that feeling when you're going to especially a popular culture or whatever, a popular concert or whatever. I had the same feeling here, although I have to admit that sometimes it was a bit weird for me to chant about Black people being murdered when I'm not one. So it was a bit like, okay, I'll just do it out of, because it's about amplifying the voices. But I mean, I have to, like on a personal note, I do hate the term empowerment, and I do hate the term because it feels this idea like I'm empowering you. So it's still me. It's all about me. And I don't like this idea of like making their voices heard and whatever. But at the end of the day, it's this. It's about creating. So I think acoustic appropriation is also a concept that relates to the fact that people don't feel like those spaces belong to them. So they have to, it's an act of protest, it's an act of even acoustic violence, if you wish, to take it, to take advantage of it and to like have, people metaphorically clutch their pearls because look what is happening. You're hearing, protests, you're hearing people playing their savage music and stuff like that. It's the same when I'm sure the first people in, when you have the festivals in Elephant and Castle of like Caribbean music and stuff like that. I'm sure the first white people there were like, oh, the music of the savages. So it's about like normalizing others in public spaces.
So is it sort of specifically focused on like marginalized or displaced communities?
Not necessarily, but that is where the bulk of the research is done. So you can even, because sonic appropriation, the idea of making yourself heard is a concept, is a, just like exaggerating, is a form of, is a form of protest, is a form of hear me out. So you can even think of like teenagers, playing music out loud or doing things that are not normally accepted. Public spaces are spaces of sharing. Technically, in supposedly egalitarian societies, we all have the same right to those spaces, and we should not disturb anyone else who is there, because that's where it is a space where everyone can feel comfortable. So then there shouldn't be a community that is louder than another. That's also why you have, noise, you have regulations related to community noise and stuff like that, because that's the whole point behind it, right? We have to cohabitate, we have to live together. So no one should be louder than the other. But this has indeed been a form of, people have been traditionally marginalized to manifest their presence, to say you cannot ignore us anymore, or, we also exist and we also have the right for this. So this was sort of the background on which I built, or I looked at the way in which Musikiosk was used in this small public square in Montreal. Because again, we come all from a tradition of, you should coexist with other people in a public space. You should not be loud. And a lot of the people who engaged with the device would not be the type of teenagers who would, for example, play music on their boombox back in the day, or who would play music loudly on their cell phones or whatever. So these are people that have this sense of responsibility towards others.
So do you think it was specifically the Musikiosk that it was this thing that sort of, did it have something to do with like an encouragement from what they might have seen as like an authority figure, that it was placed there and regulated and said you can use this to exert sonic control over your space? as opposed to them just setting up with their own boombox, which they might not think is allowed, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there was a small matter of cognitive dissonance there. So they knew they could because we had told them they were allowed to. But then again, we were also young researchers, and there was like our project in a small square. So there's also this aspect of like, is it really okay? And we're like, yeah, we have permission, but is it really okay? So they wanted to one extent, but then again, it's not something that they're really comfortably engaged in, because that was not, that's why we also collected information on introversion and extroversion. That was also something that was part of it, because, it's also a matter of personality. Would these people be comfortable sharing, again, because music is also part of an identity. So when you acoustically appropriate your space, which is again something that is not part of our normal norms of appropriate behavior in a public space, it means you want to represent your identity. It means you want to, for lack of a better term, shout out your identity for everyone to hear. So then, even being encouraged to play the music, then you also are like, you're just in a moment of like, oof, but what is okay? Like, because these are people that would still want to adhere to those norms. So then they scramble in their mind and subsequently their phones or their iPods, because at that time iPods are still a thing, to see what is the most, harmless music they could play. What's something that would not disrupt, what's something that would not bring in an element that would be considered extraneous, or that would be considered problematic, or that would give a wrong impression of this person's identity.
Yeah. So I think moving a little bit away from Musikiosk to sort of what you've been saying about the sort of the control that was imposed on, making sure that one group of people isn't louder than the other. A thing that I found really interesting, I was reading like a history of how noise ordinances were created in the US. And if I remember correctly, one of the first ones were like wealthy residents, I think in Boston,
in New York City, if I'm not mistaken.
It might, yeah,
because of the harbor. Make more
sense. Yeah, exactly. Complaining about like the noise from the harbor and that sort of stuff, which then kicked off like the whole history of noise ordinances and noise pollution legislation. Do you think that, so because I come from like a noise control background, where we go to those legislations a lot, should we be thinking a lot more about sort of the history of how that stuff was imposed?
Certainly. I mean, that's why there's an entire trend now in policy studies to look at what is equitable, what is, people of color, people who are from minoritized communities. I mean, it is this, trifecta of like social class, economic class, then you sprinkle in some race on top of it, and you got yourself communities that are the ones who are more likely to be subject to inequitable policies. Like, it is known that for decades, it was always, Black communities or poor communities who were living in areas that eventually were deemed to be uninhabitable. For example, in the United States, those were the people that would be living close to the highways. Those would be people that would be living close to the airports. So we cannot pretend that policies, noise control policies, and other types of practices we can't pretend that they have nothing to do with the socioeconomic complexities of the societies in which they are embedded. For sure, I mean, there was an entire history of poor people being loud and ratchety. Like, it's, I think it was Goethe, or I'm really blanking out on the name of the poet, but he was saying that, of course, he was a white man. I'm sorry, but it was a white man, was a white, rich, wealthy man, had nothing better to do than to engage in, because you told me I'm allowed to, in intellectual masturbation. And he was complaining about the fact that one needs quietness to be able to think. One needs quietness to be able to produce, like works of deep intellect and whatnot. And these poor people, these goddamn poor people with their loud, smelly, whatever, inappropriate, amoral lives, they're the ones who are stopping our development from moving forward. So that is something that has been the bottom line and the underlying idea behind a lot of policies. And especially in the 20th century, that's always the underlying thing. There's always an aspect of you build these complaints on the people who can afford to be quiet are the people who don't really engage in activities that are loud, meaning they don't engage in industrial activities, meaning they don't do things that are, loud because they have the money to do something else. And you also notice, for example, in Montreal, the quietest neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that are the wealthiest. They're the ones that have the most parks. They're the ones that have the most, the lowest density in buildings. Everything, anything from noise regulations per se, but also to urban planning, to urban development, all of these are intermingled along socioeconomic lines.
And they get this sort of feedback loop of those wealthier communities are already designed and able to be quieter.
Right.
But then also they're the ones who tend to get the legislation to protect the quietness of those spaces. So they get this feedback loop of these two things, ignoring the communities that had a highway built through them.
And they're the ones who tend to complain.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're the ones who have the right to complain because it's usually quiet. So they hear something, what is that? It's noise. But other communities would not complain. Also because of fear of repercussion. Like you have to call the police. Again, the reality of the United States is that, you call the police, they're underrepresented. The communities that would call, it would be Black communities, it would be Hispanic communities, it would be communities that do not have a particularly comfortable history of interacting with the police.
I suppose that's it. So when you first mentioned acoustic appropriation, sonic appropriation, and exerting control over the sound, I was thinking about it more sort of the way that you first presented it, of making sound and exerting sound to shape the sonic environment. But it is also about like just straight up controlling the sound environment, where we've done some research on the socioeconomic factors behind noise complaints. Specifically here in London was our research, and it goes contrary to what noise control people would think, where the wealthier neighborhoods have more noise complaints, even though they are actually the quieter places. But it's because those are the neighborhoods that feel comfortable exerting control and complaining and saying, no, this should be quieter. So
and also where emergence is a bigger issue. I mean, now to go back to more acoustic concepts, right? You have the idea of like the background noise or the usual levels are quite low. So then when there is an emergence, when there is something that really pops up, then you're like, what is happening? You got to fix this. Whereas if the background noise itself is just the hum of highway and industrial work and just busy life,
you don't notice the new things coming in over top of it.
No, and I think one of the things that I think we know about the various effects of noise over health, but we also have this idea of like people who say, well, I'm used to this. Like I grew up in a city, I grew up in New York City. I don't care about the noise of sirens and I don't care about those things. Yeah, you don't care, but your body cares. So there's also the aspect of people accepting it. And sometimes, I think nowadays for our generation, maybe less so, but there's this idea of like pride in having grown up in a city, and I don't care about the noise. It's not something that it's something that I'm totally used to as a thing of resilience to show that we're people of the 21st century. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that there is no long-term effects on our body. The physiology of our body is very much affected, even though we don't cognitively recognize it. So there's again aspects that when it comes to noise, we have been tolerant of things, and we've accepted things, saying that that's part of urban living, that's part of everyday stuff, whatevs. But it's not necessarily something that we have to accept, and I'm not talking here just in terms of like the levels that are dangerous for us, but just the everyday annoyances. Those ones still have an effect on us.
Yeah, and it's the type of sound as well. I've grown up and lived my whole life in a city, and I don't really want it to be quiet, like the countryside. I value countryside quietness, but I don't necessarily, that's not why I live in a city. But there's a difference between, harmful, annoying sound and just the pleasant, vibrant sound.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
I definitely agree. And it's, I mean, when I give this presentation on like race, gender, and whatnot, I usually give the example from The Wire. I don't know if you've seen it, the show. One of the
I know
bigger
of it, but I haven't seen it.
Oh, mine.
I know,
Everyone interested in understanding sociology should definitely watch The Wire. But anyway, there was a scene in there in which a teenager from New York, the city from Baltimore. There you go. He's in danger of being murdered, so he's taken to his grandmother's or something, who lives out back in the countryside, and he starts hearing birds, and he's super spooked because he doesn't know what the hell those sounds are. And his grandma's like, "No, these are birds." It's like, what the hell? Where's the cars? Where's the shootings? Where's the, where are the things that I'm used to? So it's anyway a shock for, But that's why, here we go on the other aspect of policies. It's not about quieting.
Yep.
It's not about making it's not about making the city a quiet space. It's not about making the city a silent disco. It's about the fact that there are still issues that need to be addressed. And there is very much a socioeconomic and racial dimension to those things.
And to bring that back to the sonic appropriation, I think that seems like it's a really important part, is allowing the people who actually live in a space to have their say in how they think that space should sound. Definitely.
But to bring that at an even, can you say more meta level? I don't know if meta is quantifiable, but anyway, at a more abstract level, it's also about creating awareness on the rights that you have. So it's about, I think when it comes to noise policies, there's so much focus on your responsibilities, like what you can't do, what you're not allowed to do, what you'll be reprimanded for. But it's also about understanding the rights that you have as a citizen, or actually in the case of the States, as a non-citizen, as a human, let's put it like that, as a person. You have rights to have...
shockingly, non-citizens have ears as well. Who would have guessed?
Allegedly. No science, no studies have come out on that. But, it's just about understanding that there are rights that you have as a person to how a space sounds like. And then you can claim those rights. So it's also about informing the public about the fact that, hey, you don't actually have to put up with all of this. You can actually, you're actually entitled to a life that's a little bit less noisy or less problematic. You don't have to live by a highway and, assume that living by, 10-lane highway is actually a part of everyday life. That's not necessarily the case.
Yep.
So I think that's why a lot of our work, or a lot of the work that I like to do, is also this, creating, like, the outreach is just as important as creating acknowledgement and awareness among policymakers, among people who actually intervene in the city, among professionals of the built environment and whatnot. Public awareness is just as important. Outreach is just as important, because people have to go to their representatives and to be like, hey, this is not okay. We need a change. Yeah. I think the only way in which there could be more efficient, not just policy development, but also implementation of policies, is when there is a combination of bottom up and top down when it comes to sound. And like you said, this has to be the result also of a participatory approach, not just of planners and designers and policymakers and whatever acousticians saying, we know what's good for you. Hold up. The people also know what is good for them, but they need to also be, it's not even teaching, it's just about unlocking that aspect of talking about sound. We go back to the same shit that you read in every introduction and every paper on soundscape. We don't have the vocabulary to talk about sound. Well, let's develop it.
Yep. All right. So, I think that's a good place for us to leave it, with a message of, regain control over your sonic spaces and learn about how to talk about sound.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Thanks so much for coming back on and talking
with
me about some sonic appropriation.
My pleasure.
The rest is just noise.
You can find episodes of The Rest is Just Noise on all of your usual podcast apps.
And on our website at justnoisepod.com. We're also on Twitter as @justnoisepod.
The Rest is Just Noise is supported by the UK Acoustics Network.